Bourgogne's Memoirs of Sergeant Bourgogne, 1812-1813, offer a personal account of his experiences during Napoleon's Russian campaign. As a sergeant in the Imperial Guard, Bourgogne describes the harsh realities faced by the French soldiers. Let's begin. We were only a quarter of a league from the town when we saw the Cossacks to our left upon the heights and to our right on the plain. However, they did not dare venture within reach of us. After having marched for some time, I found the horse of an officer of artillery stretched on the ground. It had a shabrack of sheepskin on its back. This was just what I wanted to cover my poor ears, for it would have been impossible for me to go any distance without risking the loss of them. I had in my haversack the scissors belonging to the surgeon's case found on the Cossack I had killed on November 23rd. I tried to set to work to cut some of it away and make what we called ear lappets to replace the rabbi's cap. But having my right hand frozen and the other benumbed, I could not manage it. I was in despair when a man belonging to the garrison of Wilna came up. He was stronger than I and succeeded in cutting the band, fastening the shabrack to the horse. Then he gave me half of it. Until I could arrange it better, I put it over my head and continued my way. I now heard cannon and then musketry fire. It was the rear guard leaving the town with Marshal Ney in command, engaging the Russians. Those who were no longer able to fight ran as fast as they possibly could. I tried to follow them, but my frozen foot and bad boots prevented me. Then the colic, which came on repeatedly and forced me to stop, hindered me, and I found myself always in the rear. I heard a confused sound behind me, and I was hustled by several men of the Rhine Confederation running off as fast as they could. I fell full length in the snow, and immediately several others passed over my body. I raised myself with great difficulty, for I was in great pain, but I was so accustomed to suffering I said nothing. The rear guard was not far off. If it passed me, I was lost. But the marshal called a halt to give the other men still leaving the town time to join us. To hold the enemy in check, the marshal had with him about 300 men. In front of me was a man whom I recognized by his cloak as belonging to the regiment. He was walking very much bent, apparently overwhelmed by the weight of a burden he was carrying upon his knapsack and shoulders. Making an effort to get near him, I saw that the burden was a dog, and that the man was an old sergeant named Denton. The dog he carried was the regimental dog, though I did not recognize it. I told him how surprised I was at seeing him carrying the dog when he had trouble to drag himself along, and without giving him the time to reply, I asked him if the dog was to eat. If so, I should prefer the horse. No, he answered, I would rather eat Cossack. But don't you recognize Muton? His paws are frozen, and now he can't walk any longer. Now I do, I said. But what can you do with him? As we walked, Muton, whose back I had patted with my bandaged right hand, raised his head to look at me, and seemed to recognize me. Denton assured me that from 7 in the morning, and even before, the Russians had occupied the first houses of the suburb where we had lodged. That all that remained of the guard had left it at 6, and that it was certain that more than 12,000 men of the army, officers and soldiers, who were no longer able to march, had remained in the hands of the enemy. He had just missed submitting to the same fate himself, through devotion to his dog. He saw very well that he would be obliged to leave him on the way in the snow. The evening of the day, when we had arrived at Wilna, at 28 degrees, the poor dog had had his paws frozen, and this morning, seeing that he could walk no longer, he had made up his mind to leave him. But poor Muton got an idea that he was to be deserted, for he began to howl in such a way that in the end he decided to let him follow. But hardly had he taken 6 steps along the street when he saw his unfortunate dog fall upon his nose. So he fastened him across his shoulders over his knapsack. And it was in this fashion that he had rejoined Marshal Ney,
who with a handful of men formed the rear guard.
While still marching, we found ourselves stopped by an overturned wagon barring part of the way. It was open and contained canvas bags, but all these were empty. This wagon had probably left Wilna the preceding evening or in the morning and had been pillaged by the way, for it had been laden with biscuits and flour. I proposed to Denton to halt a moment, for my colleague had come on again. He consented willingly, especially as he wished to rid himself of Muton in one way or another. We had hardly stopped when we saw at the back of a ravine a troop of about 30 young Hessians, who had formed part of the garrison of Wilna and had left there at daybreak. They were waiting for Marshal Ney, about 30 paces away from us, and ahead of us to the right. At the same moment, we saw on our left another troop of horsemen, about 20 in number. We recognized them at once for Russians. They were cuirassiers in black cuirasses over white coats, accompanied by several Cossacks scattered here and there. They moved on so as to cut off the Hessians and ourselves and a vast number of other unfortunate men who had just caught sight of them and who turned back to rejoin the rear guard, crying out, "Beware of the Cossacks!" The Hessians, under command of 2 officers who had probably caught sight of the Russians before we did, put themselves in order of defense.
At this moment we saw a grenadier of the line pass near to us, running to take rank among the Hessians. We prepared to do the same, but Denton, hampered by Muton, wished to put him in the wagon. We had not time, however, for the cavalry came at a gallop alongside the Hessians. There they halted, signing to them to lay down their arms. A musket shot was the reply. It was that of the French grenadier, followed by a general discharge from the Hessians. At this report we expected to see half the troopers fall, but to our astonishment not one did so. And the officer who was in advance and who ought to have been shot in pieces seemed to be whole and sound. His horse simply leapt to one side. He turned round again instantly towards his men. They all thundered upon the Hessians, and in less than 2 minutes they were sabred. Several took to flight, but the cavalry pursued them. At the same time, Denton, wishing to rid himself of Muton, called out to me to help him, but 3 of the men in pursuit of the Hessians passed close by him. So as to defend himself better, Denton thought of retiring under the wagon where I had taken refuge, suffering terribly from colic and cold. But he had not time, for one of the 3 horsemen was on the point of charging him. Denton was fortunate enough to see the man in time and get ready for him, but not so well as he could wish, for Muton, barking like a good dog, hampered him in his movements. Meanwhile, although nearly dying of cold, I felt rather better and had arranged my right hand to make use of my weapon the best way possible, having hardly any strength left to speak of. The man wheeled continually round Denton, but at a certain distance, fearing a musket shot. Seeing that neither of us attempted to fire, he no doubt thought that we were without powder, for he advanced upon Denton and hit him a blow with his sword, which the latter parried with the barrel of his musket. Instantly the man crossed to the right and gave him a second blow upon the left shoulder, which struck Muton on the head. The poor dog howled enough to break one's heart. Although wounded and with frozen paws, he leapt off his master's back to run after the man. But being fastened to the straps of the knapsack, he pulled Denton down, and I thought all was over with him. I dragged myself on my knees about 2 steps ahead and took aim. But the priming of my gun did not burn. Then the man, shouting savagely, threw himself on me. But I had had time to get under the wagon and present my bayonet at him. Seeing that he could do nothing to me, he returned to Denton, who had not yet been able to rise on account of Muton, who all the time dragged him sideways, howling and barking after the cavalry. Denton was dragged against the shafts of the wagon, so that his enemy on horseback could not get near him. This man faced Denton, his sword raised as if to split him in two, appearing all the while to mock at him. Denton,
Although half dead with cold and hunger, his face thin, pale, and blackened by the bivouac fires, still seemed full of energy. But he looked odd and really comical, as that devil of a dog was barking all the time and dragging him sideways. His eyes were shining, his mouth foamed with rage at being at the mercy of such an enemy, who in any other circumstances would not have dared stand up 1 minute before him. To quench his thirst, I saw him fill his hand with snow and carry it to his mouth and instantly seize his weapon again. Now in his turn he threatened his enemy. By the man's shouts and gestures, one could see that he had no command over himself and seemed to have drunk a great deal of brandy. We saw the other passing, repassing, and shouting round some men who had not been able to reach the side where the rear guard would come. We saw them thrown into the snow and trampled under the horses' feet, for almost all who followed were without arms, wounded or with frozen feet and hands. Others, who were stronger, as well as some Hessians escaped from the first charge, were able to withstand them for a little, but that could not last either. They must be relieved or captured. The cavalryman with whom my old comrade was doing business had just passed it to the left when Denton shouted out to me, "Don't be frightened, don't steer. I'll finish him off." Scarcely had he said those words when he fired. He was luckier than I. The cuirassier was struck by a ball which entered under the right arm first and passed out again on the left side. He uttered a savage cry, moved convulsively, and at the same moment, his sword fell with the arm that held it. Then a stream of blood came from his mouth. His body fell forward over his horse's head, and in this position, he remained as if dead. Hardly was Denton rid of his enemy and free from Muton so as to seize the horse, when we heard behind us a great noise, then cries of, "Forward, fix bayonets!" I came out of my wagon, looked towards the side from which the cries came, and saw Marshal Ney, musket in hand, running up at the head of a party of the rear guard. The Russians, on seeing him, took to flight in all directions. Those who rushed to the right on the side of the plain found a large ditch filled with ice and snow which prevented them crossing. Several flung themselves in it with their horses, others stopped still in the middle of the road, not knowing where to go. The rearguard seized several horses and made their riders walk on foot amongst them. Afterwards, they were left on the road. What else could one do? One could barely look after oneself. I shall never forget the marshal's commanding air at this moment, his splendid attitude towards the enemy, and the confidence with which he inspired the unhappy sick and wounded round him. In this moment, he was like one of the heroes of all time. In these last days of this disastrous retreat, he was a savior of the remnant of the army. All this took place in less than 10 minutes. Denton had rid himself of Muton so as to get hold of the horse, when a man, emerging from behind a clump of pine, threw the cuirassier off the horse, seized the animal by the bridle, and made off. Denton shouted to him, "Stop, rascal! That is my horse! I killed the fellow!" But the other escaped with the horse amongst the rabble of men who were hurrying forward. Then Denton called out to me, "Look after Muton, I'm going after the horse, I must have him, or there will be the devil to pay." The last word was hardly out of his mouth, when more than 4,000 stragglers of all nations came on like a torrent, separating me from him and from Muton, whom I never saw again. This seems to be the place for giving a little biography of the regimental dog. Muton had been with us since 1808. We found him in Spain, near the Bonaventura, on the banks of a river where the English had cut the bridge. He came with us to Germany. In 1809, he assisted at the battles of Essling and Wagram. Afterwards, he returned to Spain in 1810-11. He left with the regiment for Russia, but in Saxony, he was lost or perhaps stolen, for Muton was a handsome poodle. 10 days after our arrival in Moscow, we were immensely surprised at seeing him again.
A detachment composed of 15 men had left Paris some days after our departure to rejoin the regiment, and as they passed through the place where he had disappeared, the dog had recognized the regimental uniform and followed the detachment. Whilst marching in the midst of men, women, and even some children, I was constantly looking about for Denton, whom I regretted very much, but behind only Marshal Ney and his rear guard were to be seen taking up a position on the little eminence where the Hessians had been attacked. After this adventure, I was forced to stop again as I was suffering so much from my colic. In front, I could see the Ponari mountain from the foot to the summit. The road about 3/4 up the left slope could be traced by the number of wagons carrying more than 7 million in gold and silver, as well as other baggage and carriages drawn by horses whose strength was exhausted, so that they had to be left on the road. A quarter of an hour after, I arrived at the foot of the mountain where some had bivouacked during the night. Traces of the fires were still to be seen, several still alight, and around them men warming themselves before attempting the ascent. Here I learned that the carts, which had left Wilna the evening before at midnight on reaching a defile, had not been able to go further. One of the first wagons had fallen open on turning over, and the money in it had been taken by those standing near. The other carriages from top to bottom of the mountain were obliged to halt. Many horses had fallen to rise no more. While they told me this, we heard the musketry fire of Marshal Ney's rear guard, and on the left Cossacks were visible, drawn by the side of booty. They advanced very cautiously, however, waiting till the rear guard should have passed to reap their harvest safely. I started off again, but instead of taking the road of the wagons, rounded the mountain to the right. Here several carts had tried to pass, but all had been overthrown into the ditch at the side. One wagon had a great many trunks still in it. I should have liked to carry one off, but in my feeble state I did not dare to risk it, fearing I might not be able to climb out of the ditch again if I once got down. Fortunately, a man of the hospital corps from the Wilna garrison, seeing my dilemma, was kind enough to go down and threw me a box in which I found 4 beautiful shirts of fine linen and some cotton trousers. Since November 5th, I had not changed a shirt, and my shreds and tatters were filled with vermin, so I put the whole into my knapsack, delighted. A little further on, I picked up a bandbox containing 2 superb hats. As it was very light, I put it under my arm. I really don't know why, probably to exchange it for something else if I had the opportunity. The road I was following turned to the left across some brushwood to rejoin the highway. This road had been beaten out by the first men who at daybreak had crossed the mountain. After half an hour of painful walking, I heard a heavy fusillade accompanied by loud cries coming from the side of the wagons. Marshal Ney, seeing that the booty could not be saved, was having it distributed among the men, and at the same time kept the Cossacks off by steady firing.
Over on my side to the right, I saw some Cossacks advancing steadily. There was no one to check them, but some men scattered here and there upon the mountain, trying to gain the road. All at once I was forced to stop. My legs gave way under me. I drank a good mouthful of my brandy and struggled on. I reached at last a point on the mountain not far from the road, and as I was searching for the right direction, the snow crumbled under me and I sank more than 5 feet up to the eyes and was nearly suffocated. It was with great trouble that I dragged myself out, completely exhausted with cold. A little further on, I caught sight of a hut, and seeing some people in it, I stopped there. There were about 20 men belonging to the guard, all with bags containing 5 franc pieces. Several of them, on seeing me, began to call out, "Who would like 100 francs for a 20 franc piece in gold?" But finding no one to exchange with them, they concluded by offering some to those who were without any. Just then, I cared more for life than for money, so I refused, for I had about 800 francs in gold, and more than 100 francs in 5-franc pieces.
I remained in this hut long enough to fasten the sheepskin over my head, so as to keep the cold off my ears, but I had no time to change my shirt. I left, following some musicians carrying money, but who were too heavily laden to go far. The firing now came nearer, so that we were obliged to double our pace. Those who were laden with money and could not run lightened their burden by shaking the 5-franc pieces out of their bags, saying that it would have been better to have left them in the wagons, especially as there was plenty of gold to take, but that there had not been time to bury the chests. However, there were many who had sacks of double Napoleons. A little ahead I saw several still coming from the direction of the wagons, carrying bags of money. As they were terribly weak and their fingers frozen, they called to those who had none to give them a share. But it very often happened that those who had carried some money part of the way and who wished to share it with the others had no more to give, as farther in front men who had none had forced a share from them. Those poor devils who had been carrying money for so long saw it torn from them, and were lucky if in trying to defend what they had, they held their own, for they were always the weakest. I had gained the road, and as I was not very cold, I stopped to rest. I saw other men come up, still laden with money, and who now and again stayed to fire on the Cossacks. Higher up, the rear guard had halted to allow some men to pass, as well as several sledges, some bearing the wounded, and loaded with as many barrels of money as it was possible for them to carry. This did not keep some men, drawn by the love of plunder, from still remaining behind, and when at bivouac in the evening, I was assured that many had rifled the wagons along with the Cossacks. I went on slowly and painfully. Presently, I saw an officer of the young guard coming towards me, very well dressed and in good health, whom I recognized at once as Prinier, one of my friends, passed as officer 8 months before. Surprised to see him going in the opposite direction, I asked him, calling him by his name, where he was bound for. He demanded in his turn who I was. At this unexpected question from a comrade in the same regiment for 5 years, I could not refrain from tears. He did not know me, because I was so changed and wretched. But an instant afterwards, "Why, my dear fellow, is it you? To think you should be so unlucky." Then he offered me a bottle which hung from his side, containing wine, saying, "Take some." And as I had only one hand free, the good fellow supported me with his left hand, and with the other poured the wine into my mouth. I asked him if he had met the remnant of the army. He said no, that as he had been quartered the preceding night in a mill some distance from the road, it was very probable that the column had passed, but he had seen terrible traces of it in some dead bodies lying upon the road. He had only heard yesterday, and in a very vague way, of the disasters that we had experienced. He was on his way to rejoin the army according to order. But there is no army left.
What is that firing?
That is the rear guard, commanded by Marshal Ney. Then he replied, "I shall join the rear guard." He embraced me before leaving, but as he did so, he saw that I had a bandbox under my arm and asked what it contained. I told him they were hats. He asked me for them, and I gave them to him with much pleasure. It was exactly what he needed, for he still wore his non-commissioned officer's shako. The wine he had made me drink had warmed me. I decided on going on to the next bivouac. An hour after leaving Prinière, I caught sight of fires belonging to some chasseurs. I went up in an imploring way. Without looking at me, they said, "Do as we are doing. Go and look for some wood and make a fire yourself." I was expecting this reply, the usual one. There were 6 of them. Their fire was a very poor one. They had no further shelter to protect them against the wind and the snow, should any happen to fall. I remained a long time standing behind them, sometimes leaning forward and stretching out my hand to get a little warmth. Finally, overcome with sleep, I thought of my bottle of brandy. I offered it to the men. It was accepted, and they made room for me. We emptied the bottle, passing it round, and when we had finished, I fell asleep seated on my knapsack, my head in my hands. I slept perhaps 2 hours, often disturbed by pain and the cold. When I awoke, I took advantage of the little fire that was still left to cook some rice in the kettle I had bought of the Jew. I scraped up some snow and melted it with some rice. I could not manage it with a spoon, as a chasseur was eating with me, so I turned it out into my shako, and we ate it in this way. Afterwards, I resumed my former position and fell asleep again, the cold this night not being very severe. December 11th. When I woke, it was still far from daybreak. After tying up my food, I rose to go on, for if I did not wish to die of cold and hunger like so many others, I must rejoin my comrades. I walked alone till daybreak, stopping sometimes at a fire, where I found dead and dying men. When day came, I met some soldiers of the regiment, who told me they had passed the night with the staff. A little further on, I saw a man with a sheepskin over his shoulders walking painfully, leaning on his musket. When I got near him, I saw that he was the quartermaster of our company. He uttered a cry of surprise and joy on seeing me, for they had told him I was a prisoner at Wilna. Poor, he had both feet frozen, wrapped up in pieces of sheepskin. He told me that not being able to walk as quickly as the others, he had been separated from the remnant of the regiment, and that our friends were very uneasy about me. 2 great tears ran down his cheeks, and he began to weep, saying, "Poor mother, if you could only see me now! It is all over with me. I shall never see Montauban again," the place he came from. I tried to comfort him by pointing out that my situation was still worse than his own. We walked together for part of the day. I was obliged to stop often, owing to my colic. It might have been noon when I proposed that we should stop at a village that we saw ahead of us. We entered an empty house and found 3 unfortunate soldiers who told us, not being able to go any further, they had resolved to die there. We warned them of the fate that awaited them should they fall into the hands of the Russians. For answer, they showed us their feet. Nothing more terrible could be imagined. More than half their toes were missing and the remainder ready to fall off. The feet were blue in color and seemed to be almost mortified. The men belonged to Marshal Ney's corps. Perhaps when he passed by some time after, he may have saved them. We stopped long enough to cook a little rice, and we also roasted a little horse flesh to eat later. Then we left, resolving to keep together. But the great crowd of stragglers came up, dragged us with them, and in spite of all our effort, we were separated and could not find each other again. I now arrived at the watermill. There I saw a soldier who, in trying to cross the ice of the little mill stream, had fallen through it. Although the water was only up to his waist, he could not get out, owing to the pieces of broken ice. Some artillery officers who had found some ropes in the mill threw them to him, but he had not strength to catch them. Although still living, he was frozen and motionless. A little further on, I heard that the regiment, if it could be still called by that name, was to sleep at this morgue, still 5 leagues off. I made up my mind that if I should have to drag myself there upon my knees, I would go. But what trouble it cost me! I fell from exhaustion on the snow and thought I should rise no more. Happily, since my separation from Rosie, the cold had greatly decreased. After superhuman efforts, I got to the village. It was none too soon, for I had done all that man could do to escape death. The first thing I saw on entering was a great fire to the right, against the gable end of a burnt house. Completely exhausted, I dragged myself there. And great was my surprise on seeing my comrades. When I got up to them, I fell almost unconscious. Grandier recognized me and hurried with some others of my friends to help me. They laid me on some straw. It was the 4th time Grandier and I had met each other since we left Moscow. Monsieur Césaris, lieutenant of the company who had some brandy, made me take a little. Then I was given some horse broth. It tasted very good, for this time it was salted with salt, while so far we had eaten everything salted with powder. My colleague came on again worse than ever, so I called Grandier and told him I thought I had been poisoned. On this he melted some snow in the little kettle and brewed me some of the tea he had brought from Moscow. I drank a great deal and it did me good. Poor Rossi arrived in as miserable a state as myself. He was accompanied by Sergeant Bailey, whom he had met a moment after his separation from me. It was Sergeant Bailey with whom I had changed the banknotes at Wilna and who had drunk coffee with me at the Jew's. He was as ill as I was. He asked me how I was, and when I told him how ill I had been after taking the coffee, he was sure that they had meant to poison us, or at least make us good for nothing. I was settling myself as well as I could on the straw near a large fire, when all at once I felt pains in my legs and thighs, so violent that during a part of the night I did nothing but groan. I heard them saying, He will not be able to live tomorrow. I thought so too and decided, as many had already done, to make my will. I called my friend Grandier and told him that I was certain all was over with me. I begged him to undertake the charge of some small articles to be given to my family if he had the good fortune to see France again. These articles were a watch, a cross in gold and silver, a little vase in Chinese porcelain. I possess the 2 last still. I also wished to dispose of all the money that I had, reserving some gold pieces that I meant to hide in the sheepskin wrapped about my foot, hoping that the Russians, when they took me, would not begin searching among my rags. Grandier, who had listened without interrupting me, now asked if I were in a fever or dreaming. I said that I was in a fever, but I was quite clear-headed. He began to lecture me, reminding me of my courage in worse situations than this. Yes, I said, but then I was stronger.
He assured me that I had said as much at the passage of the Berezina, when I had been quite as ill, and since then I had come 80 leagues. As for the 15 that remained before reaching Kono, they would be done in a couple of days. With the help of my friends, I should manage them very well. Tomorrow, they would only walk 4 leagues.
So he said, try to rest and wrap up those things again. I will only take your kettle and carry it for you. Another said, I will take this other case, the sergeant's case, which must worry you. Meanwhile, Rossi, who was lying near, remarked, My friend, you will not be here alone tomorrow morning. I shall share your fate, for I am quite as bad as you are. The journey today has done for me, and I shall not be able to go any further. But when the rear guard passes by, we may be able to march with it, for we shall have had some extra hours' rest. If we have not enough strength to follow it, we will go to the right, to the first village or the first house that we find, and put ourselves under the protection of the Baron or Master. Perhaps he will have pity on us until we are better, and we can reach Prussia or Poland. Very likely the Russians will not come further than Kauno. I told him that I would do as he wished. Monsieur Césaris, whom Grandier had just told of my intention, came up to comfort me. He said that the pain I suffered only came from the fatigue of yesterday. He made me lie before the fire, and as there was plenty of wood, they piled on enough to roast me. This fire did me so much good that the pain gradually left me, and I slept for some hours. Poor Rossi did so too. In 1830, I was appointed an officer of the staff at Brest. On the day of my arrival, sitting at table with my wife and children at the Hôtel de Provence, a man sat opposite to me, very well dressed, who looked at me a great deal. Every other moment he stopped eating, and his head resting on his hand, he seemed to think deeply, or to be recalling certain memories. Afterwards, he spoke to the landlord of the hotel. My wife, who was beside me, pointed it out to me.
Yes, I said, that man begins to puzzle me, and if it goes on, I shall ask him what it means. At that very moment he rose, threw down his napkin, and passed into the office where travelers' names were registered. He re-entered the dining room, exclaiming aloud, "It is he." I was not mistaken, calling me by my name. It is indeed my friend. I recognized him by his voice, and we were in each other's arms. It was Rossi, whom I had not seen since 1813, 17 years before. He believed me dead, and I thought the same of him. For I had learnt on my return from prison that he had been wounded under the walls of Paris. This recognition interested all who were present, about 20 in number, and we were asked to relate our adventures during the Russian campaign. This we did willingly, and at midnight we were still at table, drinking champagne to Napoleon's memory. It is hardly surprising that at first I did not recognize my comrade, for I left him delicate, and I found him stout and strong, his hair almost grey. He lived at Montauban and was now a rich merchant.
When the moment of departure came, I thought no more of remaining behind, but it was impossible to walk alone. Grangier and Leboud held me up under the arms, and others did as much for Rossi. At the end of half an hour's walking, I was much better, but all the way, I needed the help of one arm, often of two. In this manner, we arrived in good time at the little village where we were to sleep. There were very few dwellings to be found, and although we were the first to arrive, we were obliged to sleep in a yard. By chance, we were able to find plenty of straw, which we used to cover us, but, with our usual ill luck, the straw took fire. Everyone saved himself as best he could. Many had their coats burnt. A quartermaster of Velite, named Coucher, was more unfortunate than the others. The fire caught his cartridge case, and his whole face was burnt. And as for me, without the help of my comrades, I should probably have been roasted, as I could not possibly move by myself. I was taken by the legs and shoulders and dragged up to the hut where General Roget and other officers were quartered. They fled on seeing the flames, thinking that the house itself was on fire. After this misfortune came a high north wind, and as we were without shelter, we entered the general's house, which consisted of 2 rooms. We took possession of one, in spite of him. More than half of us were obliged to stand up the whole night, but still it was better than staying outside, exposed to bad weather. That would have killed 3/4 of us.
December 13th. Kona was at least 10 leagues off, so General Roget made us start before daybreak.
A shower of hail had fallen, forming ice upon the road. If, as on the preceding evening, I had not had my friend's help, I should very probably, like so many others, have finished my life's journey on that last day in Russia. It was hardly dawn when we reached the foot of a mountain which was one sheet of ice. What trouble we had climbing it! We had to squeeze ourselves into groups to obtain mutual support. On this march, there was more readiness to help one another than before. Probably it was the hope of arriving at the end of the journey. I remember that, when a man fell, cries were heard, "Stop! There is a man fallen!" I noticed a sergeant major of our battalion shout, "Stop! There! I swear that not one of you shall go on until the 2 left behind have been picked up and brought on." It was by his firmness they were saved. At the top of the mountain it was light enough to see, but the slope was so rapid and the ice so smooth that no one dared to venture down. General Roget, some officers, and several sappers who were walking in front had fallen. Some picked themselves up, and those who were strong enough went down in a sitting position, guiding themselves with their hands. Others who were weaker trusted to Providence, that is to say, they rolled over and over like barrels. I was of this latter number, and I should most likely have thrown myself into a ravine or been lost in the snow, but for Grangier, who went in front of me, moving backwards and stopping so that I ran into him. He drove his bayonet into the ice to hold on by, and when I came up he moved further, sliding and repeating the same process till I reached the bottom bruised all over and my left hand bleeding. The general had ordered a halt to assure himself that everybody had come up. The roll call had been taken the evening before, and happily no one was missing. It was broad daylight, and we could see that the mountain might have been avoided by turning to the right. The other corps who were marching after us came along this side of it without accident. This climbing had tired me so much that I could only walk very slowly, and as I did not wish to abuse the kindness of my friends, I begged them to follow the column. One of the company, however, stayed with me, a Piedmontese, by name Falopa. I had not seen him for several days. Those who were fortunate enough to keep their health, to have unfrozen feet, and to march at the head of the column, missed seeing all the disasters which I, for instance, sick and crippled, witnessed daily. Those in front could not see the men who fell around them, while we in the rear passed over the long train of dead and dying that each corps left behind it. We had also the disadvantage of being harassed by the enemy at our heels. Falopa, the man who had stayed with me, was in no better position. We had been walking together for a quarter of an hour when he turned towards me saying, "Well, Sergeant, if we had those little pot of dripping ear that you made me throw away in Spain, you would be very glad, and we could make fine soup." It was not the first time he had made that remark. The episode, comical enough, was this. One day, after we had made a long expedition in the mountains of Asturias, we were quartered at Saint Iliome, a little town in Castile on the seacoast. I was quartered with my subdivision in a large building forming the right wing of the courthouse. This part of it was very large and inhabited by an old bachelor, absolutely alone. On arriving at his house, we asked him whether we could buy some butter or dripping to make soup and cook some haricots. He replied that even for gold there was none to be had in the entire town. A moment afterwards the muster was called. I left Falopa to do the cooking and commissioned another man to search through the town for some butter or fat, but none was to be had. When we came back, the first thing Falopa said to us was that the old bachelor was a rascal. "How is that?" He answered us, "Look." He showed me 3 gallipots containing some beautiful fat that we saw was goose dripping. Everyone exclaimed, "There's your Spanish beggar for you. There's a rascal." Our cook had made some splendid soup and had prepared some haricots. We sat down to eat under a great chimney piece like the entrance to a house, when suddenly the Spaniard returned, wrapped in his brown mantle, and seeing us eating, hoped we should enjoy our meal. I asked him why he had not wanted to sell us the dripping. "No, senor," he answered, "I had none. If I had had any, I would have given it to you with pleasure and for nothing." Then Falopa, taking up one of the little pots, showed it to him. "Then this is not fat, is it? Rascal of a Spaniard." Looking at the little pot, he changed color and stood as if thunderstruck. Pressed for a reply, he told us that it certainly was dripping, but the manteca de ladron, thieves' fat. He was a town executioner, and what we had found and made our soup with was the fat of hanged men, which he sold for ointment. That concludes the 17th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.